G'day viewers. So, what have we learnt through all this? Well, firstly, the first point I'm trying to make is that European swords were generally not kept super duper sharp. This should be fairly obvious from the amount of grabbing of swords, just grabbing the other person's sword to disarm them, or grabbing your own sword to use it in some sort of half-sword fashion, that you see in historical texts through all periods. And as you can see, it's not just an armoured thing, it has plenty of use in unarmoured fights as well. We recently had Stephen Fick from Devonrish European Martial Arts in California come out for a visit, and we got him to do a few seminars on half-swording, it being a thing he's very good at and experienced in, and we aren't. And I asked him how sharp would he keep his swords for use in this sort of combat, and his answer was not much sharper than a butter knife. So the ones I've been using are certainly a bit sharper than that, but the point is made that you don't want to do any of the sort of grabbing of swords if your swords are absolutely razor sharp. As a little bit of an aside, I want to make it clear that you can sharpen your broadswords and long swords to absolutely razor sharpness if you want. But even if you do, they tend not to hold their edge for very long. I know this from personal experience. One session of cutting tatami mats is enough to take the sharp edge right off one of my various cutting swords. And I think it's because the blades are so very, very thin that they just don't hold that sort of edge particularly well compared to, say, a katana. Recently, we also had a conference, and I had a friend who's a Japanese sword practitioner come out and do, amongst other things, some test cutting for us. And the difference between one of his katanas that is sharpened for competition cutting and the sort of things we use, it's just night and day, a completely different beast. So don't compare what you do and what we do to what happens in Japanese test cutting competitions, because it really is a completely different universe. So that's the first point. The second point I guess I'm trying to make is that if you want your sword blows to have a disabling effect on your opponent, then you do have to hit them pretty hard. One of the other things that has happened is I went to the International Saber Symposium in Hamburg a couple of months back, where there was a excellent presentation by this gentleman. On the effect of sabre blows delivered during the Napoleonic Wars, particularly from the French side of things. And you can read the article which came out of the presentation here, and I will place that down there so you can follow the link. But the short version of it is that people could take dozens upon dozens of sabre cuts to the face and body and suffer horribly disfiguring wounds and yet remain combatantly effective. They will get slashed left, right and centre, and they keep fighting, usually until somebody stuck a point in them. So quite often I hear people sort of demonstrate techniques with little touchy-feely cuts and say, oh, well, in Blossfechten that should be sufficient. The evidence from history suggests that actually, no, it's not. That when people are fighting for their lives, they can take some fairly serious damage and continue to fight. And on that note, I would also like to draw your attention to an article in Sparta 2, which was published about 10 years ago now. And the article is this. So this is The Medical Reality of Historical Wounds by Richard Swinney and Scott Crawford. And it's essentially comparing the sort of damage that we see delivered in various historical treatises with various techniques with modern case studies of people who have suffered horrible industrial accidents or have been victims of horrific crimes and had things like their arms lopped off and their bellies split open and knives shoved through their skulls, and managed to get themselves to ER departments, perfectly functional, and say, can you please remove this knife from my skull? And it's definitely worth tracking down, and is a very important read, because it does give you an idea, essentially the same as the historical information is, that people can suffer horrific injuries and still remain effectively functional. And their conclusion is that we as historical swordsmen tend to overestimate the efficacy of the blows that we deliver. Now, something that strikes me about all this is that it offers some level of explanation to the constant thrust versus cut argument that you get in various treatises. Okay, there's no end of references of people saying thrusts are more effective than cuts, and if the evidence from the Napoleonic Wars is anything to go by, they have a serious point. But then again, you have systems like Silver, who says quite specifically, the blow, when strongly made, taketh off the arm and the leg, and yea, even the head. Likewise, Thomas Page's broadsword talks about blows that will split the skull or let the entrails out. And I think that there is a definite distinction in historical treatises and in real life between what we might call slashes, okay, cuts that are not disabling, and the sort of downright blows that Silver is so fond of, things that really are permanently disabling, something that will split the skull, take the head off, take the arm off, and end the fight that way. And there's a definite difference between those two types of cuts, if you like. We know from history, again, that sword blows certainly could take arms and legs and heads off. Here is an account, eyewitness account, written of the Battle of Killiecrankie between the Highlanders, who, if we believe Page, would have been doing something pretty close to what Page describes. What happens when they took to their broadswords against the regular army. Accounts of battles with Highlanders are full of similar descriptions, where the broadswords just lopped people into, and it's certainly a fight stopper. So I think that the cut versus thrust argument, with a little bit of an aside, but I think a lot of the time they're talking apples and oranges. Silver is talking about a blow that will remove a head, whereas Swetnam, for example, is talking about a blow that will slice a face open. And Swetnam is quite right in that that's not necessarily going to stop an angry person, and you might have to stick your point in them. Whereas the sort of blows that Silver delivers, on a full pass with his entire body weight behind them, are much more effectively lethal. Now, that dichotomy between the sorts of cuts that different systems uh, tend to deliver also has some implications. So the first one really brings us back to where we started, and that is that if you are practicing the sort of militaristic systems that I do, so Silver and Page, for example, you are talking about blows that are designed to kill or disable at one fell swoop. Okay, one good solid full power blow and the fight is over. And if you're going to practice these sorts of arts, then you need to be able to deliver those sorts of cuts, and therefore you need to wear appropriate protection so that you can do that at each other and not actually kill each other, which is more or less where I started this entire journey. The other point that then comes through is, of course, that there's going to be different expectations between practitioners of different systems. Blows that somebody else might think is a good clean hit, I might consider completely ineffectual and keep fighting. And so those sorts of expectations need to be managed. But it also brings up some interesting points when we compare the sorts of blows that different systems do. So, for example, if somebody attempts to hit George Silver on the head, and his parry and riposte is likely to look something like this. Now that riposte is obviously a fight stopper that is designed to split the skull in two and finish the fight. Now the problem with it, if you want to call it a problem, is of course in terms of speed and time, and it is entirely possible that the attacker can recover their sword and get out of distance perfectly safely. Now, Silver wouldn't consider that a problem. He would say, if two men are perfect on their fight, then neither shall be able to hit each other. So if the guy's good enough to recover and fly out, so be it. Eventually, you won't be able to hit each other, and eventually you'll decide you aren't fighting about anything important and go to the pub instead. And Silver would consider that a win. But not all systems are like that. So I've chosen an example from Maya. So rather than parrying with the true edge of the sword and then riposting with a good solid downright blow, what Maya does is actually slip away, parry with the flat of the blade, and let it propel the sword around and flicks the false edge onto the top of the opponent's head like this. Now, if I channel the spirit of Silver, he would say, well, what's the point of that, okay? That's not going to kill him. That's going to annoy him at best. And Silver certainly has a point. But these techniques exist, okay? This is a clear example, and I've picked this one because there's absolutely nothing like this in any of the British systems. As fond as the British are of the hanging guard, there's no ripostes, anything remotely like this in any of the recorded systems. So what's going on here? There are various possibilities. So, for example, it could have something to do with the conditions of use. So if, for example, Maya is describing a rough and tumble sport where the aim is not to kill your opponent, but just to crack their head open and draw some blood in the way of English single stick, then this riposte makes perfect sense. Okay? By snapping that false edge over onto the head, you pretty well guarantee that you won't kill them. You will just open up their skull and get some blood. So, possibly, these techniques are designed to be non-lethal precisely because they want them to be non-lethal. There's also the possibility that these techniques are there because they have a higher probability of landing. So, as we saw, if I riposte in an English fashion from the hanging parry, true garden parry, there's a good chance my opponent will get away by recovering a sword and getting out of distance. However, Myers' riposte is much, much faster. Okay, so my recovery is, if I'm the attacker, my recovery is much less likely to get up in time to prevent myself from being hit in the head. So, in effect, what Meyer is doing is trading a bit of lethality for a higher probability. So he's deliberately choosing a riposte that is going to be less effectual, but it has a much higher likelihood of actually landing. So if you can't get the good lethal downright blow in on their head, then maybe you've just got to settle for a scalp cut. Now, for me, this solves a little bit of a mystery. Back a number of years ago, when talk of the afterblow first emerged on the internet, I and other members of Staccato kind of looked at it askance. Say, afterblow, seriously, afterblow. Because we're used to things like silver, and if I do this, there's no afterblow after this kind of return. Okay, you're not going to keep fighting after that. Your head is split in two. If, however, you're talking about a riposte like Myers, then yes, of course there's going to be a bloody afterblow, okay? You've probably just annoyed the bugger, and he's going to hit you back, and you've got to be prepared to deal with it. So I think it's important to realise that there's blows and blows. Okay, there are the sorts of slicey cuts that you see in a lot of historical systems. They certainly exist, that by themselves are unlikely to be lethal or disabling. They are not going to be fight stoppers, and so you might have to deliver 2 or 3 or 4 of these in order to get an accumulative effect on your opponent. And some systems certainly, the Bolognese stuff, which I'm reasonably familiar with, certainly advocates redoubling blows and striking multiple times in a single attacking phrase. Whereas the English stuff is about striking once and flying out, and not staying in distance and trading blows. And the reason, I think, is because they're talking about completely different sorts of cuts. Okay, one is talking about slices, any individual one of which is unlikely to be a fight stopper, whereas in Silver, who's all about the downright blow to the head, and Page, which is all about power generation, what they're looking for is one good cut that will split the soul, remove the arm, remove the head, and stop the fight. And so this is why they do one cut and then retreat out of distance, because it's talking apples and oranges. As far as we're concerned, certainly when we're doubting, and certainly if you're doing some sort of tournament-y type thing, I think that what that means is that the efficacy of individual cuts really needs to be taken into account. Okay, I have issues with the idea of the afterblow. I think it's a terrific training tool for teaching people to recover and get out even after they've hit somebody, just in case they're not dead. But as far as tournaments go, it leads to people choosing to ignore perfectly valid attacks that would kill or disable them in real life, and then getting their afterblow in. And I think that's it. Training people to ignore a valid attack is a terrible, terrible thing. So, taking account of the potential efficacy of any particular attack, I think, is really, really important. I have heard, I don't really follow these things, but I've heard that there is now a move to include what they call lights out rules. In other words, if somebody does receive an absolutely fight-stopping, killing blow, then their afterblows don't count. And I think that's just common sense. Yes, of course you want to do that. That is a positive development. So, we've run out of daylight, and I've run out of beer. So that concludes this little series on martially effective blows. I hope it's been somewhat enlightening, and I can only suggest that people go out and do this sort of thing for themselves. I know that a lot of people don't do a lot of test cutting, so I think it's really, really useful thing to get a sort of normal kind of sharpness and see how well you can cut things or otherwise. And don't be embarrassed if you can't. Okay, it does take a little bit of practice to get the effect that you desire, and take that back to your bouting and try and do what you have found to be an effective cut in test cutting on an actual person. And you will probably find, like Maya, that it's actually pretty hard to land a really, really effective fight-stopping blow, and sometimes you've just got to settle for what you get and wear them down through a series of less effectual cuts. And that itself, I think, is enlightening in terms of the tactical choices that different historical systems make. So, that concludes this little series. I hope you enjoyed it.